Welcome to Question Time. On tonight's panel, Nadhim Zahawi, the government's Business and Industry Minister, formerly Minister for Children and Families. Labour's newly appointed Shadow Justice Secretary, formerly a minister in the Blair and Brown administrations, David Lammy. Donna Kinnair, trained nurse and specialist in medical law and child protection, now Chief Executive of the Royal College of Nursing. And joining us down the line from Aberdeen, Professor of Bacteriology at Aberdeen University, an expert on diseases such as E. coli and BSE, Hugh Pennington. Good evening. Welcome to my guests here in the studio and to Hugh, of course, who joins us down the line. So I'm delighted to say we have a virtual audience with us, courtesy of Video Link. And this week our audience is from Southampton. Hello to all of you. Very nice to have you here joining us this evening. And of course, if you're watching from home, you can join in the conversation on social media at BBC Question Time. So do join in the conversation. Right, let's start with our first question tonight, which is from Olu Rowe.
Thank you. Recent events in the US are arguably a direct result of decades or centuries of African Americans feeling oppressed in numerous areas, including career opportunities, healthcare, economics, or politics. To what extent does the panel think that the UK suffers from similar systematic racial issues? And what do you believe we can do to address this?
Well, of course, Olu, this is prompted by the horrific death of George Floyd in Minneapolis. David?
Well, George Floyd looks like us, could be us. But I think what's striking about this moment is that when you look at the protest, it's black and white. It's, of course, many young people, all kinds of people saying enough is enough. And his last words were, "I can't breathe." People are saying, not just in America, but also in this country, of course, that none of us can breathe. None of us can breathe with this structural racism and discrimination that's, yes, very deep in America, but it's present also in our own society. David Cameron asked me to do a review, it's now 4 years ago, on the problems of an overrepresentation of black and Asians and minority ethnic people in the criminal justice system. And it is the case that in our own country, you're 9 times more likely to be stopped and searched by the police. During this coronavirus, 52% of those who are getting fines are black, Asian or minority ethnic people. Over the last, since 1990, 183 black, Asian and minority ethnic people have died in police custody. So we have our own problems here. What can you do? Well, the first thing is all of us have to stop expecting black people to make the case for structural racism. Educate yourself. There are some fantastic books out there by Afua Hirsch, Reni Eddo-Lodge, Arkeela and others who have written about this subject. Educate yourself. Say to your challenge, your friends, your family, of course on social media, people who are clearly racist. It's got to stop. When you look at social media, it's full of it. And I'll see it again tonight after the end of this show. Ask your politicians, your member of parliament, your councillor to do something about racial profiling. Get involved. And if you must protest, and I applaud those who are actually taking to the streets in our country.
Did you take to the streets, David?
I didn't take to the streets because I'm a public servant. I've got a position of responsibility, and I do think that you can't, in 1 week, condemn Dominic Cummings for travelling up the country and the next go out into public. But what I would
because of social distancing, was that the issue?
What I would say to those who do go, socially distance, take your sanitizer, wear your mask, but yes, protest, make some noise, and take this all the way to November because we know what Donald Trump is up to. This is deliberate. The military, the calling for shooting, his behaviour, he's winding up parts of his base who want to see this conflict between black and white in his country because he thinks it might keep him in office. Stand up to it.
So, Olu, let me ask you, I mean, your question is about does the UK suffer from similar systemic racial issues? What's your view? What's your experience?
Well, I think, without question, I think everyone would know. I think we've come from a time, well, I'm talking about going back in decades and centuries where there were structural implementations that were conscious, that disadvantaged, black people and people of colour, and then we've moved forward into a situation whereby it's probably a stubborn approach to, okay, yeah, we know there's something going on. No, we're not really ready to do that yet. And then probably more in recent times, it's probably been more like an apathy. Is a spotlight on us? Not really. Let's leave it for a bit. But now the spotlight's on, and obviously prevention is always better than cure. And here we are in a situation where if prevention had been implemented, then we wouldn't see the ugliness that we've seen in terms of, what I mean is in terms of the protest. I'm not calling that ugly. What I'm calling that is desperate and passionate. But,
right.
These are ugly things. Nobody wants to see this.
You're talking about there've been lots of peaceful protests. You're talking about those where there has been violence and where there has been looting. Yeah. And let me, Donna, I was just going to ask, Donna, looking at your career, which is stellar, sparing your blushes, but it's a stellar career. You must have broken through quite a few glass ceilings to get where you have. Do you still see systemic issues of racism in the UK?
Well, as a nurse, you see it every day. You see it both in the structure that you're within, in the institution of health here, the NHS institution. If you look at how many managers have broken through the glass ceiling, black managers, you'll see that there are very few. But I also, as a nurse, we face these issues on a daily basis. Just look at the outcomes for our patients. Every single measure that you can apply, the outcomes are worse for black and minority ethnic patients. So whether it's diabetes, whether it's those that end up with amputations, the structure of our society it is inherent. The structural racism is inherent, and the outcomes are poor for a number of people that are of black, Asian and minority ethnic communities. So it's personal to me in terms of my career. Yes, you do have to bash down some glass ceilings. You do have to circumvent some overtly racist people. But for me, it's just look at the health of our nation, and that will tell you about some of the structural inequalities that we have.
And Nadhim, is racism something you've had direct experience of?
Yeah, I think to Olu's question, I don't think anyone, my colour or Olu's colour or David or Donna's colour, would say they haven't. It's almost impossible. I think when
Can you give us any examples?
I'll tell you, when we first came to this country, my parents came as Kurdish immigrants from Iraq. First thing people call me was a Paki, and I tried to explain I'm not Pakistani, if that's what they mean, but I'm originally Kurdish. You get bullied. I saw a horrific video online of two white kids asking a black kid to go down and kiss their feet. You get that sort of behaviour at school at the time, but you sort of try and survive it. I'd like to think things have changed, and they have in many ways, but I think some of it's been transformed to social media. Back to David's point, or mine, or Donna, you still get casual racism, everyday racism. He doesn't quite belong in Stratford-on-Avon. He's not from here. That sort of stuff. Well, it's difficult for someone with a name like Zahawi to claim that he's a born and bred Stratfordian. But nevertheless, I think things are getting better. There's lots of people speaking. I'd like to think, well, let me just say this. Millions of people have come out and said, enough is enough. I can't breathe.
But also the Equalities Minister, Kemi Badenoch, said today the UK is one of the best countries in the world.
Well, I was about to say, so I think there are lots of great things that have happened in our country that has allowed people like myself, like David, like Donna, to do well in life. But we can go even further. I think we can go much further. And I did this in the Department of Education when I was Families Minister, working with the Perm Secretary, because the Perm Secretary there basically didn't think that we were trying hard enough, because if you look at the profile of the civil service, look at the profile of parliamentarians, sure, there are very few people of my colour or David's colour in the leadership roles in those institutions. Back to Donna's point, even in the health service, we need to do better. There's no point us just sort of saying it's OK and that's fine. Sure. We have to do better. Now, I think there's one good thing which is really good. I have to just share this with your audience. My 7-year-old came up to me, right, unprompted, and said, Dad, 7 years old, Mia, she said, Dad, Black Lives Matter. And I just looked at her, I said, Mia, where did you get that from? She goes, Dad, I got it from TikTok and YouTube. And I said, what does it mean, Mia? She said, it means that no one should be killed because of their colour. And
so presumably then, just picking up on what David said, Trump's comments, for example, about when the looting starts, the shooting starts, you condemn that? I think any comments that cause division is wrong. I retweeted... So that one in particular? Do you condemn that comment? I condemn any comment, that comment and any other comment that divide us. George W. Bush released the most beautiful statement about how you bring people together, you bring the country together. And I want to think of all the millions of people who will peacefully go out and demonstrate, observing social distancing, and not the few agitators. All right, well, let's hear from our... Let's hear from our audience. There's plenty of hands up. Flora.
Hi, I just want to say that you're talking about how you want to address the racism within this country, but the problem is that if we don't start speaking out, if the government doesn't start speaking out and condemning what's going on in America right now, then we are being bystanders. We're watching this happen and we're not trying to stop it. And I think it's all well and good leaving the responsibility to the public to be protesting in a time when we should be social distancing. But because the government is doing nothing, they are complicit in the actions that the public is having to take to show our support for America, because no one in the government is doing that. Ben?
I first of all wanted to thank Mr. Lammy for the work that he's done on educating non-black people for years on this issue. Before now, but I also wanted to address Mr. Zahawi in asking him what his government is doing to improve the curriculum in schools, because I think a huge amount of the problem here comes from lack of education about black history in the UK, because it's all well and good us looking at the United States now from a distance and saying this isn't our problem. But we have a huge, long history in the UK, from slavery at our ports to Windrush, the Macpherson report, and then Diane Abbott becoming one of the first black MPs in the country. We don't learn that. And now we have Belly Majunga, who it looks like the justice system has given up on. And it's because we don't learn about these black voices, these black faces, and we just don't know what our own history is.
Audrey.
Hello, yes. I just think it's horrible what's happened, but I wondered whether, bearing in mind all the positive vibes we've had, the clapping every Thursday, we know that a lot of the people, and I'm sure Donna will agree with me, who looked after us come from ethnic minorities. Should we not be harnessing that power and doing something with it right now, rather than allowing it to disappear? And I just wondered whether any of the politicians had ideas how we could do this.
OK, well, let me come, before I come back to the panel. Hugh Pennington, I wanted to come to you just on the original question. To what extent does the panel think the UK suffers from systematic racial issues similar to those in the States, and what can be done about it? Now, you were marching after the death of Martin Luther King. So you've seen this over many years.
That's right. I'm really rather pessimistic. I lived in the US at that time, and you know, there were terrible things happening, and I went to Chicago and the National Guard was out on the streets. You know, everything seems to repeat itself. And I think an important thing that we must do, and I agree with the audience member who's talking about history, the US has this terrible legacy of slavery, and we have a legacy from the empire. And clearly, these are very important historical things which still have a big effect. And if we learn more about them, and if children learn about them at school and learn about what happened and learn about what should be done to correct any kind of problems that persist, and we know that many problems do persist, my pessimism will stay. I hope I'm going to be more optimistic than that. And after all, the US elected a black president, but it's work in progress. It's work in progress, but it's work in progress that we must put all our shoulder behind to make sure that things do improve.
Hugh, thank you. I've got one more question on if we wanted to talk, given what's happening in the States and the demonstrations that have been here, we really wanted to discuss the issue of race at the beginning of this programme. We've got a slightly different take on it from Aisha Roberts. Rob, can we hear your question, Aisha?
Well, my question was just, should the government actively be doing more to protect people from ethnic minorities against the virus?
So we've had a report, haven't we, Aisha? Donna, of course, you'll be very familiar with this. I mean, age and sex are the biggest risk factors when it comes to coronavirus. But then you look at Bangladeshi ethnicity, for example, that's double the death risk from coronavirus compared to the white British, and then other black, Asian, minority ethnic groups 10 to 50% more at risk. I mean, Donna, is there more that can be done in terms of staff, for example, in terms of nursing? Is there more that can be done to protect them as opposed to their white counterparts?
Well, there has to be more that needs to be done. I mean, that whole report was commissioned on the basis of the question of why is this happening? And yet we've had surveillance, we've got statistics, but we haven't yet answered why. And nobody expected an answer to come overnight. But surely there's much more we can do to protect nursing staff. So I think there's something about the adequate PPE. I was on this programme not long ago saying that we needed the most adequate PPE. Are
you getting that now? Well,
it's still patchy. There are some hospitals that are getting it, but we know that there are many care homes that are struggling to still receive PPE, protective equipment. We also know that those district nurses are still struggling to get proper PPE. And it's interesting that, we've had the latest announcement about face coverings, and yet
yes, so face coverings on public transport will be required from the 15th of June.
Yeah, but we struggled to get nurses to have masks when they were less than a metre away providing care to patients. So there has to be more.
And do you think then that BAME nurses, for example, should be prioritised when it comes to PPE, given the stats that we know and how much more at risk they are?
Well, it looks as though, we don't know from this report whether it's linked to occupation or exposure. We know that the viral load increases the more exposed you are to the virus. And many BAME people work in frontline positions. We've seen that through the bus drivers. We've seen that most of our nurses are at band 5 delivering care, our healthcare assistants. So there are many questions yet to be answered. But in the meantime, obviously, I'm a public health nurse, so I'm looking for protection before the answers occur. So as much protection as we can give people is absolutely essential. And if that means that those with underlying conditions are redeployed from the front line, so be it. Their protection is hugely important. And that, I think, goes to my concern about the question that was asked previously, really, is that, I stood on the front lines trying to fight for patients' lives a few weeks ago. So I don't really want to see that trashed. I put my own life at risk, and so have many other healthcare workers. So we really want people, if they are protesting, to observe social distancing, because there's no point in us coming back to look after them because of another cause.
So just picking up on what Donna was saying, Nadhim, 11 weeks now we've had this lockdown, and she is still seeing people who haven't got PPE. How is that possible?
Well, first of all, that shouldn't be happening. If it is,
then
I wouldn't
I'm sure
look at any case that Dame Donna brings up, because actually I can tell you from my own local experience, both care homes and, of course, the NHS. They've got the PPE they need.
Yeah, but Donna's talking about, I mean, that's all great, but Donna's 11 weeks on, and I've had countless people here from the government saying, we're sorting it, we're getting out next weekend, all the lorries are on their way. It's not a question of supply, it's just a question of logistics getting them round, which obviously turned out not to be the case in the end. How are we 11 weeks on? Donna's sitting there. It's the second time since the lockdown we've had you on the programme. We still haven't got PPE where people need it.
Well, all I say to you is both the experience locally and nationally where the PPE is there. In Warwickshire, it's there for any care home as they ask.
Well, that's all very well. But listen, you've heard Donna's experience.
I'm trying to answer the question to say if Donna has a specific example, I will happily take that away and look at it, because at the moment that should not be happening. Aisha, what I would say in answer to your question is a couple of things. One, Professor John Newton, who's the expert on this, said now that we've got the report, the first thing that's going to happen is that NHS England is getting it out to the NHS trusts so they all have the data in front of them. Secondly, my colleague Kemi Badenoch, who's the Equalities Minister, is now in charge of making sure that whatever we do, we follow the report findings and effectively take that and translate that into actions that we will take to make sure actually people of BA-ME backgrounds are protected.
Hugh Pennington.
Well, the report was a bit disappointing in the sense it didn't come up with answers as to why, for example, people from Bangladesh are much more likely to die from this virus than other people, with different ethnic backgrounds. Now, I can understand why, because to drill down to the data, you've got to look at patients' hospital records, for example, to look at their particular circumstances. And I sincerely hope that is proceeding with pace, because that is going to be quite a long task. It's going to take a long time to do. I do this sort of thing in medical legal work, and it's very, very time-consuming. However, it has to be done because basically what we want to find out is what is going wrong. Why are people, say, from Bangladesh, because they were at the top of the list in terms of mortality, why are they in that group? And we can't understand it. We don't know. Is it something to do with lifestyle? Is it something to do with housing? Is it something to do with deprivation? Is it something to do with occupation? Can't say. But it is possible. That data is out there, but it's going to be very difficult to accumulate it. We want to get that right now because the virus hasn't gone away. And, all these groups of people who have higher mortality rates, and that's a very strong measure. You can't laugh that off. Well, no, of course not. It's vitally important that while the virus persists, we must do something to protect people who are more at risk in terms of having a very serious infection and dying from it. It's a no-brainer, and we've got to get that work done. If you have to hire 20 PhD students to go through the notes, we should be doing it. We should be doing it right now.
Kieran, you've got your hand up.
In light of the recent report, then, is it safe for children now returning to school and workers returning to work from ethnic minorities safe to go back to work and school?
I mean, this is what it comes down to, because the question from Aisha is what can the government do about it? What should the government do to protect people? Where do the results of that report take us? I mean, does it take us down the route of if you are black, Asian, minority, ethnic, should the lockdown be tighter for you? I mean, is that even remotely acceptable to think that? Should there be certain jobs that you shouldn't be going back to, or children not going back to school? Treating people differently because of their ethnic background?
Fiona, let's be clear. Right across black and Asian communities in this country, there's fear and anxiety. It's now getting to the stage where it's hard not to know someone who has died. I've lost an uncle. I've lost a classmate at 45. I've lost 20 people in my local mosque and 6 others in the other mosque. I've lost my chief rabbi in the community of Tottenham and Haringey. So what people want are action. And what they can't understand is...
So what action should there be, though?
We are being told where we can do physical exercise, who we can meet, where we can travel, what we should wear on transport. There are guidelines and rules. People are told if you've got certain prevailing illnesses, you should shield. If you're of a certain age, you should protect yourself, stay away from the rest of your family. Ethnic minorities now want recommendations. They want risk assessments at work, particularly because we're talking about a community of people who arrive from Asia and the Caribbean who came to work in public services, the NHS, post offices, our transport system, London Underground. Of course there's viral load. They come into contact with many people and we've had no answers. So I say to Nadhim, I say it in I don't want to say it in an angry way, but I say we need action now, not just the rhetoric about all this is terrible, but where we've had guidelines and rules for others, can we now have some to protect and save lives? If protecting the NHS and saving lives means something, it's got to mean something also for black and ethnic minorities in our own country.
OK.
David, and to Kieran's question. So, Kieran, 80% of schools actually remained open to make sure that the critical workers, frontline workers, and those children who are in need could actually still get to school. We are very, very slowly, deliberately slowly, asking schools to return for the early years and, of course, Year 1 and 6 as well.
But that's not what Kieran was talking about.
I'm going to get to the.
Because we've only got a limited number of time.
You can't just have half an answer when you.
But what you do need to do is answer the question. And Kieran's point was not what children are going back to school when. Kieran's point was should children from black, Asian, minority, ethnic be more protected or perhaps go to school at a different time because of that?
I was about to say, if you'd allowed me.
No, I'm all ears.
No, that's fine. But I was about to say that if we all follow the rules, we make sure we follow the social distancing rules. We've issued guidelines across education environment, across construction, warehousing.
OK, so it's just follow the rules as are.
Guidelines. If you follow the rules, you socially distance, you wash your hands, then you will be safe and we will continue to bear down on the island.
OK. Hugh, you wanted to come in.
Yes. I think one thing we can say pretty certainly from the Public Health England report and also from all the other studies that have been done in China and South Korea and New Zealand is that children, anybody under 20, has a very low risk of having any kind of serious illness with this virus. There's this very small group of younger children that get this, what's called the Kawasaki syndrome, but that's incredibly rare. So I think from children's point of view, there doesn't seem to be any effect of social background or anything else that's going to determine whether they fall ill, because they just don't fall ill in the first place. And this is a very peculiar virus because there is this very strong relationship between age and having a bad outcome. The older you are, over 80s are 70 times more likely to die than people in their 40s. And so, that's an enormously impressive statistic, which doesn't happen pretty well with any other virus. So I can put that in as reassurance that children are not going to get serious illness, they're not going to have complications and so on. But, of course, one question that hasn't been answered is, are they going to get the virus, have an inapparent infection, and then take it home and infect their parents and their grandparents? And that's something that still is not certain. It doesn't look very likely, but we can't rule it out.
OK, let's take another question now from Lorraine Jones.
Hi, panel. Doesn't the 14-day quarantine for incoming travellers to the UK seem pointless when we are mostly lagging behind the other European countries in getting control of the virus, as the main EU countries now have a lower transmission rate than the UK?
I mean, that's the point, isn't it, Nadhim? Why is this a case of shutting the stable door after the horse has bolted? I mean, when other countries had a higher infection rate than us, we were letting them in. We still are. You can still come here from Brazil, which has got a very high infection rate. You still come here from New York. But now we're talking about stopping countries. In case of Europe, they've all got a lower infection rate than we have.
So let me sort of try and... It's a really important question, Lorraine. So when this virus was first in the containment phase, where we were able to contain it, it was right that we introduced quarantine and effectively dealing with people coming from Wuhan and then the rest of China in early January, if you remember.
But we let everyone else come.
From high-risk countries during the containment phase.
Because as it turned out, the Italians and the Spanish had a huge infection rate, but we let them come in.
But no, actually we didn't, because we actually stopped people coming from northern Italy, then we spread it to the whole of Italy. We did the same from Iran, we did the same from Japan, and of course very early on from Wuhan and the whole of China. We did that very early on. But then when we went from containment to delay, when actually the virus was already spreading through our communities, the scientists and the advice was to say, actually, there's almost no difference of actually doing anything at ports and airports.
But what they're not advising you now... But now they're not advising you, are they, to introduce quarantine?
All the advice now is when actually infection rates are low and coming down even further, the risk from a spike from outside of the United Kingdom is much higher, which is why we've introduced the quarantine. We've also introduced a review of it, Lorraine, every 3 weeks, so we make sure that we are able to effectively, for example, and this has been talked about, look at other countries and build air bridges to safe countries, which is to your question, Lorraine. That is an important part of this. All these decisions, Lorraine, are really difficult, but actually, when the virus is low and coming down even further, it's the right thing to do to not allow people to come in without quarantining.
David?
It's got to be based on the science. The WHO said back in February, quarantine. Germany quarantined, Greece quarantined, Taiwan quarantined, New Zealand quarantined. We didn't. 100,000 people have come into the country.
David, in January, we dealt with people from Wuhan.
People have come into the country from all over. And now we've got a situation where we know that 40,000 have died from COVID, but if you look on the year-on-year figures, it's 60,000 people we've lost over this period. We've got the worst rate. In fact, we have a higher rate than the whole of Europe combined, and now we're quarantining? This feels like late. We were late on the lockdown, late on the testing, late on the PPE, and we're late again on quarantine. That is a fact.
I would listen to you if you just didn't quote an inaccurate stat by saying we've got a higher rate than the whole of Europe, which was on the BBC last night, on Newsnight, and was proven to be wrong, because if we were using the same scale of measure as Spain, we would have reported only 20 cases of deaths yesterday, and that, I'm sure the BBC at some point
Is there
will
a country in Europe that has a higher death rate than us?
Let me just listen. Every death is a terrible situation. Every death is regrettable. I am not sitting here and saying to you that everything we've done well, but at the end of this crisis, we will we'll learn the lessons, because it's only right that we look at this, and we've tried to be as transparent as we can be. But it's wrong to quote figures that are completely spurious.
Sorry, no.
What can I just?
Keir said, get a grip. We are languishing globally. We're a laughingstock. People have died. It's horrendous. People can't believe
David, you're talking about
Britain is so behind the curve globally because we've been slow and dithering.
It is disappointing that you're making this a partisan point in the way Keir is. Keir is the man who couldn't even agree to his own proposals for the EU negotiations under Theresa May.
Let me just say, I want you to succeed. I want you to succeed because I don't want more people to die. But
then take away the inaccuracies. Tell the truth. Do not quote the BBC, which were wrong last night, and I hope they'll correct it tonight.
On quoted figures, we are amongst the 1, 2 and 3 in the world for global deaths. There's no doubt about it. And even if the figures come out to slightly higher in other countries, we will still be an outlier.
And we have to learn the lessons. And we have to learn the lessons. And I am not proud of that. I'm saying to you, we have to learn the lessons.
But the Prime Minister said he was proud of our record, but you're not proud.
No, I'm not proud of the deaths. Nobody can be proud of deaths. I'm proud of our record to stand up a testing system from a few thousand tests a day to 200,000 tests a day today. I'm proud of the record of the NHS and the amazing nurses and doctors and the frontline workers who made sure the NHS never failed, never broke, and continued to treat people with COVID. I'm proud of what we've done in Bays and in the Treasury to make sure that businesses got the money that they needed to survive, to make sure that 8.7 million people get their wage packet today from the furlough scheme. I'm proud of all of that.
All right, let me bring in the rest of the panel. Donna, the question is about quarantine. is it pointless now?
Well, it feels a bit late to me. I will say that on the 8th of March, I had a trip booked to Italy. I didn't go because I could see what's happening in Italy, but I could have gone and I could have come back, and it was to Milan. So
actually, people from northern Italy could come here.
Well,
I know you say they couldn't. They could come here. They were asked to self-isolate when they arrived, but they were allowed into the country.
Yeah, I chose to lose the money off my flight because it seemed pointless to go and contaminate and bring back. But I do feel that we were a bit late to get to it. However, we are where we are now, and the important thing is that actually we do the right thing. So it isn't about quarantining now. It's about us complying with the standards, washing our hands, social distancing, doing the right things to protect ourselves from this virus. The virus hasn't gone away. It's still virulent. We can all still catch it, and we are where we are. It's a bit pointless, really, whether we look back in history, because we've had 40,000 deaths now, and the only thing we can do is protect ourselves going forward, and that's by complying with the science and the guidance that we have. I think that's the important thing now, going forward.
Hugh, I'll come to you in a minute. There's quite a few hands. Actually, Lorraine, you wanted to come back in.
It just seems to me that we've missed the boat. And if we're going to quarantine, why wait until Monday before we actually put it in place if it is so important? Because basically, up until Monday, people could still come in. And so what's the point of it?
Carrie.
Hi there. Thanks for letting me join. I've got quite an important point to make, actually, as you were talking about stats and testing and R rate.
Well, we're talking about quarantine specifically at the moment. Yeah,
OK, well, sorry, then I probably need to rewind a bit. I was trying to interject with David speaking. I have COVID. I've tested negative twice, but been told on clinical presentation and from my bloods that I have it, and that there is a 30% failure rate with the swabs. So we're potentially missing 30 in 100 cases. So how can we rely on those stats? You know, where do we go with that?
Well, I think we may come on to testing later, actually. So we're just going to hold that thought for a minute, Kerr, if that's all right. Thaddeus, you've got your hand up too.
Yeah, I was just sort of wondering, can you name any one country that is actually willing to let us travel there and travel back? Because we do have the highest community rate and much higher death and infection rates than any other country in Europe. And yet we're talking about blocking them from coming when it's probably safer for them to not come here and not quarantine than it is for us to go there and affect them.
Well, there are quite a few countries that we can go to. I mean, we can go to Italy very soon. We can go to Portugal now, I think, possibly other countries in the world. Hugh?
The argument is a bit academic, because many countries won't let us in because we have such a high rate of infection.
But do you think we should be having quarantine measures here, Hugh, to stop people coming into our country?
Oh, yeah. I mean, there's time to do that when we've got our infection rate low, very low. We haven't got it very low yet. It's coming down. It's coming down very slowly. It's coming down more slowly than you know, the press conference at number 10 would like, you know, the experts there and so on. Until we've got it down a good bit further, then our residents will be welcomed in Italy and Spain and Greece and all these countries. At the moment, I don't think the Greeks will let us in, because, you know, they have a much lower incidence of infection than us. They don't want to be importing infection. So I think it's a little bit early to be talking about quarantine. It's right to make a plan for it when we get to that you know, happy point when we've got the virus right down to low levels. But at the moment, you know, I think one has to say that it's a great pity this wasn't done a long time ago, because my own view, and it's only a guess because we haven't got the statistics published, is that we had lots of outbreaks in this country started off by people coming back from high incidence countries, you know, Italy particularly, and the virus going under the radar. Well, it didn't really go under the radar. It caused lots of infections, but it came in a subtle sort of way. And we clearly don't want that to happen in the future, but it's a little early to be talking about that now, because we still have this very high infection rate. We've got to get it down before we can really get the quarantine thing rolling. It's right to make a plan for it, but whether it should come in Monday or not, emeritus.
Adam.
Yes, hi. If the government brings in regulations concerning quarantine, how effectively are they going to be able to actually enforce the quarantine? There's talk of 1 in 5 people being randomly checked, but that's probably not good enough. Does that mean they'll be checked once every 5 days, the same person? Are the people in quarantine going to be allowed to go and shop and receive medical supplies? I think it's realistically unenforceable.
Well, I think the suggestion actually is not quite as favourable as you're making it. I think it's 1 in 10 are expected to be checked by border officials. Actually, Nadhim, let me ask you about this, because people are required to supply an address and a phone number. They can give you their mobile, or they give the border officials their mobile phone number. Just wondering what the point of that is, because obviously if you give your mobile phone, you can be anywhere. If someone rings you and checks you are supposedly where you say you are. If you go to Greece, for example, you have to supply a landline number or you can't get in. But what's the point of just giving a mobile number?
Well, they have to fill in an online form with the address and phone number. And, of course, there is a fine if they don't comply with the quarantine as well. But most people, you'll find, and before I became a politician, I ran a research company. Actually, most people will do the right thing. The reason we've done well, because the British people have done well, because actually they have complied with the rules of social distancing, of washing their hands.
And so you think a mobile number is perfectly adequate?
Well, I think people will do the right thing, because if they're coming to this country, filling in a form and saying, actually, I will come and I will quarantine, then they will do the right thing. And I think, look, we will keep this under review. We will continue to take these tough decisions, because these are difficult, and we do need people to work together. We can't do this on our own. But we know the evidence suggests that when the incidence rate is low, we should actually try and make this work with our borders.
OK, let's take another question from Mike Golding.
Hi there. We're always told that we're following the science, but the government's own science advisors, who we watch daily on the coronavirus update, look and sound increasingly nervous about the early reduction in lockdown before the UK track and trace system is fully operational and proven. Does the panel feel that, in fact, we're easing lockdown too quickly and so risking more deaths, a second wave of infection, and as a consequence, further untold increased damage to the UK economy?
Now, Hugh, you don't believe a second wave is likely at all, do you? I just wonder if you could explain that.
No, I'm calling myself a second wave sceptic, because the idea of a second wave is based on what happened with influenza in 1918. And I don't think that's a particularly good model. People will remember that 1918, we were just coming out of the First World War, and the virus was very different. The virus that caused that second wave of deaths was very different. It attacked different people. It killed more American soldiers than the Germans did at the end of the First World War. And we don't even know whether the first wave virus was the same as the second, and we don't know if the third wave virus was the same as the second or the first, because the virus wasn't discovered until 1933.
So what makes you think, sorry to interrupt, but what makes you think a second wave won't happen with coronavirus, given that we're hearing from the WHO and so many countries around the world, not least our own, that there are fears that it will happen?
I think what would happen if we got locked down wrong would not be that we'd have a second wave, where a second wave is defined as the first wave goes away, then there's a gap, nothing happens, and then the virus takes off again. And, that hasn't happened in any of the countries which have managed to reduce the virus down to very low levels. Now, the big test is going to come in China, because China has essentially released its citizens from lockdown, and SAGE, the advisory committee, has been very confident that China will have a second wave. Well, time will tell whether it does or not. No sign of it yet. China is much more worried about, in fact, all the cases in China are imported cases coming in to China from other countries and so on. So I think the second wave, I can't say it won't happen, but I think it's very unlikely. What will happen is what's happened in Singapore, where they had very good controls, and then the virus got into these migrant worker dormitories and took off, a bit like it took off, and it's still busy, in our care homes, because these were very difficult places to have infection control. The virus would hang around. It wouldn't wouldn't be a second wave. It would just be the continuation of the outbreaks hither and thither. And that's the sort of noise. Those are the sort of noises that are coming out of people like Matt Hancock at the moment. That this is what we have to worry about. This is what we have to stop happening with our contact tracing. Because that will enable us to identify these outbreaks. Because this virus specialises in causing outbreaks. About half the cases are in outbreaks rather than just single cases in the community. So that's why it's so important to have the contact tracing up and running before we really do any kind of massive release on lockdown. I think what's happened so far is essentially pretty trivial chipping away at the lockdown, and we'll see whether that has any effect on the R number. And the R number itself, well, perhaps we can talk about that later as well as a good measure or not of how much virus, how busy the virus is.
Mike, you wanted to come back in.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's kind of arbitrary, whether it's whatever you call it, whether you call it a second wave or an increase in infection. The point is that the R number we know is very close to 1, and it seems to me that the government's messaging, in also some conscious and some unconscious, has led towards a quite significant increase in traffic and people on beaches and people at beauty spots. So it does, and for instance, even protesting, you can see that there are causes for concern.
And does that make you anxious, Mike?
Increase in the epidemic.
Does that make you anxious, Mike?
Not for me personally, but it makes me anxious for people around me, for people who we know in our area who are in the at-risk group. And, I would say it would be going a bit far to say it makes me anxious, but it certainly concerns me that I don't want to end up going back into a lockdown.
OK. Well, let me ask the panel here. Donna, the thrust of Mike's question is the lockdown being eased too early?
Well, at some point the lockdown has to be eased as we go into the recovery phase, because we know that the lockdown's taken its toll and lives will be lost in terms of economics anyway. So at some point it needs to be eased, but my view is that actually we need to do it sensibly. We've got to come out of it sensibly. We've got to understand the rules, and people need to follow them. So I'd go back to saying, if we can, it depends on a real high compliance to the rules that are put out there. Even if we continue with the lockdown, people are becoming restless anyway. So we're going to have to do something to mitigate that restlessness and make sure that we do come out of lockdown safely.
And do you think now is the right time?
I guess if we can maintain some of the things, the hand washing, we know that kills the virus. We know it's still amongst us and that there are steps that we're going to have to take. We don't know how long it's going to hang around. So we're going to have to live our lives very differently in terms of going forward. And it will mean that we are going to have to socially distance for a while longer. We are going to have to be a bit more protective in the gear that we wear. We are going to... So whether we do it now, next week or 2 months' time, we have to gradually come out as long as we have a sensible rationale for the steps that we're taking.
Anne-Marie.
I was just thinking along the same lines as Donna, actually, that a lot of the measures that the government are bringing in at the moment, quarantine, to wear face masks, social distancing, etc., all rely on people's goodwill and the general public agreeing to these measures. And I was just wondering what the panel's thoughts were on how can the government actually try and improve public goodwill with regards to the introduction of a track and trace app, for example, when it's very clear that the public are getting a little bit fed up at the moment and going out on beaches and such like at weekends and clearly breaking a lot of the rules.
Ben?
I just wanted to touch on something that Dame Donna briefly mentioned, because I think that while Mike is right to say that it's really important that we listen to the health experts, I think it's equally important that we listen to the economists, because I think we are going to approach a point soon where the lives lost due to the economy being shut down exceed the lives lost because of the virus. I mean, I've heard stories about chemotherapy care being delayed. Suicides in mental health wards are going up. And they're not life, but schools, the deprived children who are falling behind because of school closures, universities closed, and teaching isn't being delivered. This will have effects for years to come, and I think it really is time to start getting out of this lockdown now.
And David, coming back to Mike's original question, is the lockdown being eased too early? In part, he's asking the question because track and trace is not yet fully up and running.
Well, I would support relaxing the lockdown, but it's got to be based on the science, and clearly we're worried about the R rate. You've got to sort out testing, which means that you've got to make sure that people can get access to a test in 24 hours and get the results in 24 hours. You've got to give local authorities the power to act quickly if there's a breakout in their particular area. And you've got to sort tracing. You've got to get to 50,000 human tracers. And you've got to have an app that works, that people have trust and confidence in. And some of the challenge is that confidence has been lost. And the government has to move quickly to regain that confidence, but also keep the messaging straightforward so people actually understand what the rules are and what they have to do. And that was some of the concern, I think, about Boris's announcement a few weeks ago, because it wasn't very clear and people didn't understand.
Olu, you've got your hand up.
Yeah, I think to Nadhim, I think the horse has bolted. Realistically, the horse has bolted. And I was on the protest in Southampton yesterday. There were a certain amount of people, a fair amount of people who were wearing masks, but an awful lot that weren't. And a lot of them were, people from, like me. And I think that one of the issues, obviously, coming back to the recent report, is that it's not even like there's been a cat amongst the pigeons, because the government, your government, have not been clear enough on, why we are affected by, why we are affected more by COVID. Has your government gone to Africa, for example, who have a better record, really, than we have in the UK? Has your government gone to the countries that are the origins of the people that have been cited in the UK to be more vulnerable? The horse has bolted, and as a parent, I would say that the energy of the government now needs to go into mitigation, because even with the track and testing, I think a significant amount of people will not be interested, they will not be listening. I think this is a fact, and there needs to be energy put into, okay, how can we mitigate against the fact that people are now not listening?
All right, Flora.
Firstly, just touching on Ben's point about the economy, I think maybe the conversation around that needs to be focused more on the inequalities that rise, because I think there are actually studies that suggest that mortality rate improves in situations of economic crises. But obviously, we really need to be focusing on how we can try and reduce the inequality impact that's going to be arising here. But secondly, also, we've seen the trust in government absolutely plummet ever since the Prime Minister's special advisor broke his own lockdown rules. And yet the trust for scientists like Chris Whitty is incredibly high. And I was just wondering whether we should start discussing whether the scientists begin to have more influence in the policies that are being made rather than just acting as an advisory group.
Lorraine, I'm going to come to you, Nadhim, of course, in a minute. Lorraine?
One of the things that they reduced on the lockdown was allowing people to travel long distances, any distance, to exercise. And of course, here in the southwest, where we had really low infection rates, we've just been invaded from huge hordes of people coming to the beaches and the beauty spots, who come from areas of the UK that have very high rates, and yet the government hasn't seemed to address that.
So, Nadhim, coming to Mike's question, Is the lockdown being eased too quickly before track and trace is fully operational and proven? Are we risking more deaths?
Mike, well, first of all, we're being deliberately slow, baby steps. So initially there was a huge pressure on the Prime Minister to open all non-essential retail by the 1st of June. And actually, the Prime Minister said, no, we will look at car showrooms and outdoor markets. And if we continue to bear down on the R rate, that by the 15th of June, we'll begin to open up non-essential retail. I'm the Business and Industry Minister, so I can tell you I've been working on all the different guidelines for different environments of work, outdoor, indoor, construction, retail and so on. And we've got task forces led by ministers looking at pubs and restaurants, looking at places of worship, theatres, all the difficult ones, salons, for example, all the difficult areas of work. So we're doing all of that work at the same time. Now, track and trace, the pilot that we ran in the Isle of Wight, actually one of the really important findings of that is people said actually the first contact they want is with a human being, which is why we've recruited 25,000 people who are track and tracers, who can deal with about 10,000 cases.
So Nadhim, when are we going to get... Now, hang on. When are we going to get figures? Because it's been a week now since track and trace was launched.
Yes.
We've had some figures that were leaked to Channel 4 News, which suggested that very few people actually are being contacted. When are we going to get figures on how many people are being contacted?
So very good question, and we are working flat out to make sure we get the figures right, because actually the other question that links to your question is the figures have to be robust and accurate, which is what the statisticians have asked us.
So you want to make sure that the UK Statistics Authority doesn't criticise you over them?
Well, no, they're right to criticise anybody, because you want to make sure that the figures you're releasing are accurate, and to get them right, because effectively people are being tracked and then traced and tested in different modes, whether through going to a physical point to...
But in terms of when we're going to get them?
Well, when we think they're robust, then we will start issuing the figures as well. And, of course, making sure the app is then fully rolled out nationally. We're also asking local authorities, Mike, to have a local plan ready, because for the first time, and this is really important, Mike, in terms of your question, the heart of your question is about confidence. For the first time, when the track and trace system is fully operational, say in Stratford-on-Avon, we will be ahead of it. That way, we can actually react very quickly with the local authority to control the virus in that area, so we don't have to close down the whole country, as we have been doing, as other countries have been doing, because the pandemic has been spreading so quickly around the world.
David, there's a big sigh. We've got very little time left. But
when are we going to get to 50,000 tracers? When is the app going to be ready?
So the app, the app, we're working flat out. We want to make sure it actually does everything it needs to do, and will be in place this month. I can't give you an exact date.
Oh, it's going to be in place this month?
It'd be wrong for me to do so.
No, but just let me be clear, because we're pretty much out of time. But the app will be up and running this month.
Well, it was running in the Isle of Wight, and we'll make sure it will be running as soon as we think it is robust.
Okay, just want to be clear. When you said it'll be in place this month, it'll be rolled out across the UK this month?
I'd like to think we'll be able to manage it by this month, yes.
OK, well, let's get you back and see if that is the case. Nadhim, thank you very much. We are out of time, I'm afraid. I just want to say, well, we could have carried this on, I think, for quite some time. But thank you very much to the panel. Thank you very much to Hugh for joining us down the line from Aberdeen. And, of course, thank you very much for our questions from Southampton this week. Very good of you all to join us. I just want to say that next week we'll have an audience, a virtual audience from Cardiff. The week after that will be from Plymouth. So if you want to join in the programme, come and be part of the conversation. Contact us in the usual way at the Question Time website, and we will get back to you, and let's see if we can get you onto the programme. And if you want to carry on tonight's discussion, I think we certainly could have here, you can join Adrian, Charles and guests on Question Time Extra Time on 5 Live now. But for now, thank you very much to all of you from Southampton, and thank you, of course, to you for watching from Question Time. Bye-bye.